Hey everyone, welcome to another Deck Tech. Today we come to a close. 5 weeks of Temur Delver. So before today, the past 4 Mondays, I released a different Deck Tech on a different variant of Temur Delver in Modern. I went through them all, check them out. There's a playlist. You can see all the different types of variants that I played. I posted matches for each one. And I figured, you know what, Temur Delver is not necessarily the cheapest deck in Modern. Why don't I show off how I would play a budget version of this deck as the 5th and final week before I move on to other deck ideas that I want to play. And, you know, I'll return to Delver, of course, at some point next year, but I think that's enough Delver for Modern for 2020, at least. I know it's crazy to say, given I'm Delver Bruise, but let's take a look at budget. So what are we losing in a budget build? We're losing mostly lands. We're losing our fetches, and we're losing our shock lands. So for me, budget means that any given card should be $10 or less in value. That's how I often judge it, and if you go off of that, most of the time in Modern, in a 60 card deck, you'll end up with a deck that costs around $200 to $300 at the most, and I think in Modern that's relatively budget. You know, bargain basement is usually, you know, mono red decks if you want to go super budget, but you know, those get boring pretty quickly. So if you want to play something with 3 colors and cheap, the biggest thing you're going to be losing is your lands, and honestly the lands make the biggest difference. The only other thing you're losing apart from lands is Tarmogoyf and Force of Negation, and those are big losses. Tarmogoyf is essentially a central part of this deck, other than Delver's Secrets, but Tarmogoyf is still would be too expensive for a budget build, so Tarmogoyf goes away, and your fetches and shocks go away, and that makes the biggest difference in the world. I had a lot of trouble trying to get a proper formulation of this deck, you know, without fetches, shocks, Tarmogoyf, and even Force of Negation, although Force of Negation is not central to Temur Delver. So let's look at what I came up with, and this is the final iteration of the budget build after, you know, grinding away, trying to win consistently enough to say that, okay, this is a decent budget build. The creatures, so we have Delver's Secrets. That doesn't go away. Delver's Secrets, luckily, is pretty cheap. You know, next up, Hooting Mandrills. Again, it's a common. It's been reprinted already, and again, it's pretty cheap. It's there. It's part of what I consider the core template of Temur Delver in Modern. So those two are there. Storming Entity, a recent arrival in Core 2021. And you know what? It's cheap, and you know, given that we're losing big creatures here, Storming Entity actually is going to be pulling its weight in a budget build. And of course, you have Hex Drinker, again, relatively cheap, and it's going to get you the wins that you're going to need to make it with a budget deck. And so this would be the creature suite. As you can see, it's not the worst thing in the world, but you don't have anything here, at least on the ground, that's going to be as efficient as Tarmogoyf. You don't have anything that you can rely on that's as efficient as Tarmogoyf, unfortunately. But it is what it is. It's a small sacrifice. I wouldn't say it's the biggest sacrifice you're making in this deck. The permission, nothing really changes here. I can't play Force of Negation because of the budget restriction, but Disrupting Shoal is perfectly fine, so there it is. You're still playing Stubborn Denial, again, cheap card. Mana Leak, cheap card. And, you know, Disrupting Shoal, cheap card. It's been reprinted, and it doesn't see that much play, so the cost is under control here. Since we are playing a lot more blue in this iteration, or at least a bit more blue than normal in this iteration of Temur Delver, Disrupting Shoal actually is pretty good here. You have a pretty balanced amount of 1 and 2 mana spells on your deck. Don't really have anything in the 3 spell range, but you have Storming Entity for those really rare 5 mana spells in Modern. But Disrupting Shoal, again, going to be pretty important here if you want to play pitch-like strategy, and I think you do, especially in a budget build. Removal, Lightning Bolt, nothing changes here. Not playing Tarfire, of course, there's no Tarmogoyf, so removal stays the same. 4 of Lightning Bolt. Moving on to the cantrips, nothing really changes here either. Serum Visions, luckily, very cheap. Metamorphose as well, very cheap, and here you're going to be able to power out Storming Entities early on with Metamorphose. And Thought Scour, of course, mostly for Hooting Mandrills to kind of power out Hooting Mandrills as well. So, This is really where we lose a lot, and I'm not happy at all with this mana base. You know, I'm perfectly willing to hear what you would suggest. I had different iterations of this until I settled on the cards that you see in front of you. I was playing Evolving Wilds, I was playing in different combinations of Fabled Passage, and it was just horrible. The inability to go and fetch a land you know, that produces a color that you need right away really hurts. This is, I guess, one of the best exercises you can execute in Modern, or I guess in any format, of restricting yourself from fast mana, essentially, or easy mana, and you being the only one doing it. Okay, so I was playing against decks that were not playing budget, and I was, and it's most of my mana base here. So Fabled Passage, I mean, Evolving Wilds is just a card that I couldn't deal with. It was just way too slow. Fabled Passage is essentially the same, except that once you have 4 more lands on the battlefield, the land comes in untapped, and that's the bonus here. That's really the only reason why I'm running 4 Fabled Passage. It allows me some color fixing, at least, but this deck is really not relying too heavily on fetches. A, because it doesn't really have access to the proper fetches, and B, because the other fetches that we can afford with the budget restrictions are not that good. But a 4 Fabled Passage essentially is going to be a must here. Catch Your Triomes, you can play different variations. You can play 1 or 2. I'm playing 2. Again, it's going to come in tapped at all times, which really sucks, but it does give you all 3 colors. And in a mana base where we don't have a lot of fetches, Catch Yours, when you do draw into them, or when you do start with them in your opening hand, are going to be very important. Spirebluff Canal and Botanical Sanctum, I guess I should talk about both of these at the same time. I mean, they're replacing our shocks, and you're going to need a bunch of them because, again, you're not really fetching, and you just need your mana fixes as much as possible. And this is where Spirebluff Canal and Botanical Sanctum come in handy. And last but not least, the lands. So usually I play 2 islands, 1 forest, and that's it. Here I'm playing 3 islands, 1 forest, and 1 mountain. The mountain is really there because sometimes you're going to need access to red, and if you have a Fabled Passage and nothing else that produces red, you need to go get that mountain. And this is really the only way you can secure a red source reliably, is by playing that 1 mountain. So it's unfortunate, but it's the best we can do with the restrictions that we have here in a budget build. One thing I want to mention before I move on is that, yes, I'm not playing the Pathway lands. In theory, you can play the Pathway lands in some number here, but realistically speaking, I'm not sure what you would replace with the Pathway lands, unless you want to get rid of Fabled Passage altogether and just throw a bunch of Pathways into the deck to cover the lands that you need. I don't really think that's going to be a winning strategy. I didn't try it with the Pathways, but mostly because I don't think I was going to be happy with what the Pathways are going to give me. This is better, as good as it can get in a budget build with a $10 restriction per card. So yeah, that's just thing. I'm sure some of you are going to be thinking about the Pathways. I still don't think they're that good, at least in a 3-color deck, in a deck like this. So moving on to the sideboard. Luckily, nothing in the sideboard is really restricted in terms of cost. So this is more or less the cards you see in any of the other Temur Delver deck techs I did in the past 4 weeks. Reality Shift for, you know, dealing with creatures that you can't remove. Grafdigger's Cage for graveyard strategies. Blood Moon to attack your opponent's lands. Though, keep in mind, you don't have easy access to all your lands, and Blood Moon is going to be harder to cast. So I stuck with Blood Moon, but you might want to move to Alpine Moon. I might even suggest you move to Alpine Moon instead, where it could be a bit more surgical, or, you know, play maybe Spreading Seas. But I think Alpine Moon's probably better because you could turn off Tron more efficiently with Alpine Moon, for example, or Eldrazi or Valakut or something like that. So I stuck with Blood Moon here, but I think if I played enough, I would have moved out of Blood Moon and just played Alpine Moon, so just keep that in mind. Huntmaster of the Fells, I mean, listen, you're lacking in creature strength anyway, so Huntmaster of the Fells, if anything, is even stronger in this build than any other build, because it's going to be stronger than most of the cards you're playing, you know, whereas Tarmogoyf would normally overshadow Huntmaster of the Fells in many instances. Abrade, you know, obviously artifact hate and extra creature removal. Veil of Summer, surprisingly, it's pretty cheap, the non-foil version at least. So you can stick a bunch of them in your sideboard, and Shadow Spear just makes it into the budget if you purchase the normal non-foil version, and it gets there for your life gain. Again, you can play around with this. This is really going to be, as usual, sideboard dependent. Check out my Temur sideboard tech video that I posted several weeks ago. I'll put a link in the description if you want in-depth analysis on all of your Temur options for sideboard options, I should say, in Modern. So the matchups, last but not least. Okay, so some things here change, some things don't. In combo, I don't think we really lose much here in terms of dealing with combo. Force of Negation is better than Disrupting Shoal in many instances, but it's not, you know, we don't win against combo just because we have Force of Negation, or access to Force of Negation, I should say. So I think our combo matchup more or less stays the same compared to any other Temur Delver deck in Modern. I wouldn't say that we're worse off. It's not like the fact that we're not playing Tarmogoyf or whatever, you know, we're going to be worse at combo. The only real thing that's really going to hurt against combo is the mana base. So if your starting lands are slow, maybe because you don't have any basics or any, you know, Spirebluff Canal or any check lands or whatever, and you're going to have to use Fabled Passage to get a land, means you're not going to do anything turn 1 or whatever, or you're not going to do anything turn 2. That's really where it's going to hurt, because combo decks tend to be fast, and if you're slow already and you're already losing on the tempo game, then combo's just going to run all over you. But generally speaking, assuming you're a bit lucky with your lands opening, at least in your opening hand, combo decks shouldn't be the biggest issue for you. Aggro decks, definitely you're going to be losing a bit here, or I should say quite a bit here in terms of your matchup against aggro decks. Whereas normally Temur Delver does pretty good against aggro decks. The budget version is going to suffer. Again, you don't have Tarmogoyf. Tarmogoyf has a big butt. That makes a big difference. And when you're not playing with it, it's going to make your matchups against aggro a lot harder. There's going to be, you're not going to have a creature that's going to be able to stay behind, for example, and just keep your opponent's creatures at bay, because they know if they just hit up against Tarmogoyf, they're going to lose. You know, so you lose that aspect, so you're going to have to heavily rely on your Hex Drinker or your Storming Entity to keep the pressure, but you're going to lose that fail-safe. And, of course, aggro decks are pretty fast, so if you're slow because of your lands, again, aggro matchups are going to be very much an uphill battle, whereas normally you would have at least a 50-50% chance in Game 1, and that increases after Game 1. Big mana decks, again, here, already this was a really bad matchup, generally speaking, and it gets a lot worse with a budget build. Again, if you're playing against Etron, you know, Tarmogoyf used to pull its weight there, and now you don't have Tarmogoyf, so you're going to maybe rely on Hex Drinker, which means you're going to have to get a lot of lands early on to pump it up, assuming your opponent doesn't destroy it, kill it, exile it, whatever. You can still deal with the non-creature spells pretty easily, but not as easily. Force of Negation would cover Karn and all that, but Disrupting Shoal won't. So again, you really lose that. I mean, I would say you almost go to 0 against big mana decks with a budget build. So again, not ideal. When you get to not magic, yeah, you didn't necessarily heavily rely on Tarmogoyf, so I guess not much changes here. Again, it's going to come down to the lands. I need to emphasize here, when you don't have fetches and you don't have access to your mana properly, and you have to wait an extra turn just because the land comes in tapped, you are going to be behind many decks that are very explosive, and not magic tends to be very explosive, and even when it's not explosive, then we have an even keel, but when it is explosive, it's almost impossible, and when you're playing with budget Delver, very, very, very difficult, very difficult. Control matchups here as well. Again, the fact that you don't have Tarmogoyf for Force of Negation is going to hurt you. It's definitely going to hurt you, because putting pressure on your opponent is going to be a bit harder. What's really, again, is going to hurt you is your lands, as usual. I feel like I'm a broken record, but I really need to highlight here how important the lands are. I've always made this comment, you know, one of the main reasons why I don't like playing Spirebluff Canal or Botanical Sanctum is because when I play a land, I want to be able to play it immediately. I want access to my mana immediately. And Spirebluff Canal, or any land that has a requirement or a condition you need to meet, you know, is a potential drawback, you know, is a potential tempo loss for you. And Temur Delver, generally speaking, is always about tempo. You know, you have to out-tempo your opponent, and just playing crappy lands or lands that come in tapped is going to hurt your tempo game here. So, again, against control decks, they're going to love the fact that you're playing slow because they like slow games. Last but not least, mid-range decks, probably, again, broken record, Tarmogoyf, it's not there. You do have Hex Drinker though, and if you can get Hex Drinker to level 3 so that it's at least protected from instants, then you have something that's a bit more viable. It's a 4/4, it's pretty decent, and you can get through. So mid-range decks, again, your win percentages are definitely going to drop, but they're not impossible. They're definitely doable. You just have to, you know, pray a little bit about your opening hand and making sure your lands are the lands that you need. And that's it for matchups. Again, I wanted to go through a budget Delver version so that you can at least see what it's like. And I have matches coming up today. You're going to see them. I have 3 matches I'm going to post that I did win in, but, you know, they were not easy. But it is doable. It's definitely doable, but there are massive restrictions, mostly because of the fetches that you don't have access to and the shocks you don't have access to. So if you were going to start off with a budget build Delver and you're saving up money to slowly upgrade it, which is perfectly fine, yeah, I mean, those are big upgrades, but they're very important. If anything, I would prioritize the lands over Tarmogoyf for Force of Negation. Definitely prioritize the lands before anything else. Ideally, fetches over shocks, because at least with a fetch you can go fetch a basic and use it immediately, unlike Fabled Passage where you can fetch a basic and then wait, most likely. So yeah, keep that in mind when you're starting off at budget and building up to competitive. So that's budget Temur Delver. I hope that was at least somewhat interesting and you got some chills down your spine, you know, thankful that you have fetches or realizing that you need to go get them. Shocks as well. Stay tuned for the matches. I'll be posting them up soon. And let me know what you think in the comments section down below. Maybe I missed something. Maybe there's another card I should try. But this is really what I thought would probably be the most efficient budget version of Temur Delver that you can start off with. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you enjoy my content in general, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, follow me on Twitter. All that stuff really helps me out a lot. It's simple for you, really important for me. A big thank you to all my patrons. Check out my Patreon link in the description of this video. I, recently upgraded all the tiers. I think they're pretty lucrative. Well, I don't know about lucrative, but they're pretty cool. You get to support Delver of Brews, and at the same time, every year, you're essentially guaranteed to win a giveaway because I give back mythics and rares to all my patrons. And those are separate from the giveaways that I do to the wider audience, just my regular viewers and followers on Twitter. So check out those tiers. I think they're pretty cool and, allows you to help another creator out as well. Thanks, and have a good one.